Hello, everyone. So, I'm going to be talking about language and culture, more specifically focusing on the relationship between language and culture. And I think to understand that, you actually have to understand language separately and culture separately before you can actually understand how they are intertwined. So, starting with a very basic definition of language. Language is the primary method of communication between people. And diving a bit deeper into that, it can be spoken, written, or signed. And the region that you live in actually determines the language that you speak, typically. So I know, for example, here in America, our two most common languages are English and Spanish. While in France, they typically use French. Of course, they learn English, but they do not use it every day in the same way we do. With sign language here, predominantly we use ASL and we teach ASL, but which stands for American Sign Language. But there are over 300 different versions of sign language. One example would be BSL, which stands for British Sign Language, and MSL, which is Mexican Sign Language. So that kind of leads us into what makes up a language. Typically, or it is not just language is not made up of just the words that you're using. It also is dialect, pronunciation, and tone, and those 3 points came directly from the source listed at the bottom of the slide. But these 3 points actually fall under a sort of umbrella term called paralanguage, and this umbrella term also covers body language and hand movements and just certain things like that. So it's important to understand culture to understand paralanguage to understand the language, which is very difficult. It's kind of like a chain. So when speaking a language, it is important to understand the culture. That way, you're using the correct term, you're pronouncing things correctly, you're not doing anything insensitively, which kind of leads us into culture. So culture encompasses the many different components that make up the way of life for someone in a specific region. And here I have just a couple of examples of what culture is or what makes up a culture. Of course, the list is very long and it's more than just these 4 points. But the first one is food, second one is music, religion, and morals. So some examples of each of these would be Eastern foods typically involve some type of rice because they were actually heavily influenced by the agriculture. Music acts as a form of communication in African cultures. They use it in celebrations and rituals and just different things like that. Mexican culture typically revolves around religion and spirituality more than other regions. And here in America, our morals typically depend heavily on the religion you follow. Um, that just means we don't have a specific set of morals the way other countries do. So how do these two aspects connect? Culture is an important part of the creation of our language, or of language. Without culture, language would not evolve into what we know today. So here's some very basic, like surface level culture affecting language examples. So over here in the European era, which is supposed to be France, it says here gender is important to speak our language. So in French, they actually gender every object, or I guess every noun. Uh, so you can tell, like, when French was evolving, that gender was very important. And what's supposed to be America, it says here different regions speak English differently. And you can kind of see that when you compare the South versus the North, the East versus the West, and then you kind of have Midwestern. So you can kind of see how English varies between each of those specific regions. So if we go a little bit further south into Mexico, um, in Spanish, they actually also gender objects, which I think is very interesting because at that point it's just memorization. Because, a fork and a spoon obviously don't have a gender, but to say those words correctly in those specific languages, they do. And down in Brazil, they are heavily influenced by both Africa and Portugal. I think the main language in Brazil is Portuguese. but you can also see a little bit of that African culture peeking through. So one thing when talking about culture, that's very important to talk about is actually internet culture. So the internet has impacted our language in ways never seen before in previous generations. So the internet has made a language more accessible. So, if we don't understand or don't know the meaning of a word, we can just Google it. You no longer have to go to the library and look at a dictionary. The sources are also, physical, the sources are not used heavily. You can just, like I said, Google it. This also it also makes it faster. You can learn languages faster. You can also spread languages faster. So, we're creating new meanings for old words. And those words, the internet is an incredibly fast-paced place. So, the words we're creating, as soon as they are introduced, kind of normalized, they are phased out, and there's a new word coming up. So I think that also kind of leads into creativity. People are so creative with the meanings that they put to these, very common words. So here in the middle, I kind of have a very generic version of, or a very generic example of an internet conversation. They're using, text language, emojis, and words with different meanings than the original meaning. So the first line says, "Bro, I'm going to fail this test so hard," with a little emoji so you know how she's feeling. And then he says, "Mom said y'all can come over. Please bring your textbook, or come over, bring your textbooks though, please." And the last line says, "No cap." So those are just 3 examples of the way emojis have affected our language, as well as text language and new words, or new meanings giving to old words. So does culture rely on language? Language and culture have a very intertwined relationship, and they are both constantly evolving to fit the other. So one example of language affecting culture would be when the French actually took over Britain and declared that France as the language of the courts. So, royals and government officials used French, and that kind of affected the culture to make the French language seem more official, or more, I guess, higher up, rather than English or any other language, Latin. So, and one way that culture affects language is obviously what we just got done talking about, the internet. We allowed internet into our culture, and it is beginning to affect our language. So without culture, our language would not be as dominant. And I think one good example is when colonizers came from Britain to the Americas. The reason that English was able to dominate is because we had so much culture behind it. While the Native Americans, they also had culture, but it was very diverse, and it varied from tribe to tribe, just like their language. So that's why it was not as dominant when compared to English. And learning a new language is just a part of the cultural exchange. It is not the whole cultural exchange. You also need to learn about the culture. You need to understand why things are the way they are. The food, the area, like what led to the language. So I think the main question that kind of sparked my interest in this topic was, did language lead to the creation of culture, or did culture create the need for language? I've seen many different arguments on this. I've seen one in particular that language led to the creation of culture because we had to establish a way to speak to each other before we could establish a way of life. But I think that culture created the need for a language because we knew our needs. We knew that we needed companionship. We knew that we needed food. We needed a way to communicate these things. So I truly believe that culture created the need for language. So, a little summary is that our ever evolving culture has helped our language evolve to fit the needs of a progressive society. It has changed the way we view ourselves, the workplace, and the way we speak. So, culture is very important to language, and language is very important to culture.